On the evening of July 27, 2000, a 35-year-old woman named Esther Penn was standing inside an old grand office building in the middle of Lower Manhattan in New York City. She was holding a thick manila folder that was completely stuffed with highly sensitive financial documents, treasury bills, and private trust agreements. Her shoulders were incredibly tense, and her entire body was aching from a long, grueling day of work. The official workday had actually ended hours ago, and almost everyone else in the building had already packed up their things, turned off their computer monitors, and gone home for the night. But Esther was still there, sitting at her desk, trying to catch up on a mountain of paperwork. It had been an abnormally busy day at the company, and she had been forced to put in several hours of overtime just to keep her head above water. The company Esther worked for was a very prestigious financial firm that managed massive investments for some of the wealthiest clients in the entire world. Because they dealt with such massive fortunes, they still relied heavily on actual physical stock certificates and other extremely important financial records. It was Esther's primary responsibility to make photocopies of these incredibly valuable documents and then file them away safely inside of a massive, heavily fortified vault located in the building's deep basement level. On this particular summer evening, the stack of files she had to deal with was much larger than usual. As she rode the old, creaking elevator down to the basement, she looked down at the folder in her arms and let out a long, tired sigh. She had been working for this company for 2 full years, and this was going to be the absolute latest she had ever had to go down into the vault during her entire time there. She was completely exhausted, and she was really just looking forward to getting this final task of the day done so she could go home, get some sleep, and forget about work for a while. When the elevator finally came to a stop with a soft bounce and the heavy metal doors slid open, Esther stepped out into the quiet, dark basement corridor. The basement was always a bit eerie at night, but she tried to ignore the creepy feeling as she walked down the long, dimly lit concrete hallway. She eventually reached the vault entrance, which was protected by a massive 2-ton steel door. Since employees were constantly walking in and out of this vault during the normal workday to retrieve and file papers, the massive door was always kept unlocked and swung wide open. Right now, as Esther stood in front of it, the huge metal door was standing wide open, just like it always did. Esther walked through the opening and stepped inside. You have to understand that this was not a small room. It was not like a small closet where they kept a simple safe. This was a massive walk-in vault that took up a very large portion of the basement floor. Inside, there were long, narrow rows of towering steel filing cabinets that stretched all the way from the concrete floor to the high ceiling. Esther walked all the way to the very far end of the vault where the specific filing cabinets she needed were located. She set her folder down on a small table and began the tedious process of organizing and filing the copies she had made. She spent over 15 minutes doing this, carefully placing each document into its proper alphabetical folder. When she finally finished, she felt a sudden wave of relief wash over her. She was finally done for the day. She picked up her empty folder, turned around, and began walking back toward the vault's exit, excited to get upstairs, grab her coat, and go home to her apartment. But when she reached the entrance, she stopped in her tracks, and her jaw dropped. The massive metal door was no longer standing wide open. It was completely closed. At first, Esther was just surprised that she had not heard the heavy door shut. It was a massive piece of steel, and you would think it would make a loud, echoing sound when it slammed shut. But she had been so focused on her filing work at the very back of the vault that she had not noticed a single thing. She walked up to the door and reached out to push it open. She figured that a coworker had simply pushed it shut on their way out of the building, or maybe a strong draft from the basement ventilation system had caused it to swing shut. She grabbed the metal handle and pushed, but the door did not move. She threw her entire body weight against it, but it felt completely solid. At that moment, a cold wave of panic washed over her as she realized the door was locked. She frantically began rattling the handle, trying to turn it in every direction, but it was completely useless. If the door was locked, there was absolutely no way to open it from the inside because there was no manual release mechanism on the interior wall. She stood back, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to figure out what to do. In the 2 years she had worked here, nothing like this had ever happened to her or anyone else she knew. But then she remembered that she was working much later than usual. She began to wonder if the vault door was on some kind of automatic security timer. Maybe after a certain hour, the door was programmed to automatically swing shut and lock itself to keep the valuable documents safe from potential thieves after hours. If that was the case, she was in a terrible position. It was late, her colleagues were all gone, and nobody was going to be coming back down here until the next morning. That meant she would be stuck inside this windowless, cold steel room all night long. She ran back to the door and began banging on it with her fists, screaming for help at the top of her lungs. But she knew deep down that it was completely pointless. The vault was designed to be soundproof, and there was no way anyone in the building, let alone on the street, could hear her. She finally stopped screaming, took a few deep, shaky breaths, and began looking around the room for any kind of solution. There were no phones, no computers, and no windows in the vault, but then her eyes landed on a red fire alarm mounted on the wall near the entrance. When Esther saw that alarm, she felt an incredible rush of relief. It did not matter that nobody could hear her. If she pulled that fire alarm, it would instantly trigger an alert that would go directly to the city's fire department and the building's security team. They would have to come down to the basement to investigate the alarm, and when they did, they would find her and let her out. She ran over to the alarm, grabbed the lever, and pulled it down. Instantly, a deafening horn began to wail throughout the vault. The sound was incredibly loud, and Esther had to cover her ears as she walked back over to the door to wait. She was completely calm now, believing that her rescue was only a few minutes away. But as the minutes ticked by, nothing happened. The alarm kept wailing, but the door remained shut. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and the door did not budge. Esther's calm quickly turned back into intense panic. She began to feel incredibly hot, and she noticed that she was having a very hard time breathing. Her chest felt tight, and she began to hyperventilate, gasping for air. She assumed she was just having a massive panic attack because she was trapped, but she was completely wrong. Meanwhile, outside the building, a fire truck pulled up to the curb. A lieutenant with the New York City Fire Department hopped out. His team had received an alert that a fire alarm had been pulled in the basement vault. The lieutenant did not see any smoke, but he and his team rushed inside to investigate. The building's security guards led them down to the basement, and soon they were standing outside the closed vault door. As the guards worked to unlock the door, the lieutenant noticed a strange, sweet chemical smell in the air. He could not quite place it, but it made him feel extremely uneasy. Suddenly, his throat began to tickle, and he started to cough violently. At that same moment, he got a severe headache. In an instant, the lieutenant realized what that smell was. He screamed at the security guards to step away from the door, not to open it. You see, Esther had been right that pulling the alarm would bring help quickly. But she did not know that the vault was equipped with an automatic fire suppression system. When she pulled the alarm, the system was designed to instantly flood the sealed room with massive amounts of carbon dioxide gas. This gas would displace all the oxygen in the room to quickly put out any fires without using water, which would ruin the documents. But humans need oxygen to survive. When Esther had started hyperventilating, it was not because of a panic attack. It was because the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. The sweet chemical smell the lieutenant detected was an artificial scent added to the carbon dioxide so that workers could detect leaks. The lieutenant knew that if they opened the door, the deadly gas would flood the hallway and kill them too. They had to call a hazmat team to safely vent the gas before they could open the door. When they finally did open the vault, they found Esther lying on the floor. She had suffocated to death. Her family later filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city and the building owners, as the system was outdated and lacked any warning signs. The outcome of that lawsuit was never publicly reported. Now, our second story takes us back to New York City, but this time, we are looking at the year 1977. Around 5:30 in the evening on Monday, May 16th, a 39-year-old man named David Toomey was standing outside the Pan Am building. This was a massive 59-story skyscraper located right in the absolute center of Manhattan, directly behind Grand Central Terminal. David was a highly successful lawyer who spent almost all of his time buried in legal briefs, sitting in quiet offices, or arguing cases in crowded courtrooms. He was a very busy man, and on this particular afternoon, he was in a major rush. He checked his watch and let out a long, frustrated sigh. He was supposed to be catching a flight at John F. Kennedy International Airport, and he was running dangerously behind schedule. The shuttle he was waiting for had just arrived, but he had to stand in a long line and wait for all the incoming passengers to get off before he could finally climb aboard. David knew he was cutting it incredibly close, but he was not overly worried yet. He had paid a very large amount of money to take this specific shuttle service because it was widely known to be the absolute fastest way to get from Midtown Manhattan to the airport. It was a high-end luxury service designed specifically for wealthy businessmen and busy professionals who did not have the time to sit in New York City's notorious rush-hour traffic. Every other time David had used this service, it had gotten him to his terminal with plenty of time to spare, so he trusted that today would be no different. He stood in the queue, watching the passengers step off the shuttle, holding his briefcase tightly. The shuttle's engines were still running, making a deep, vibrating hum that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Once the last passenger stepped off, the line began to move forward. As David started to walk toward the entrance, he took a brief moment to stop and look up at the sky. He wanted to soak in just a few seconds of fresh air and sunlight before he spent the next several hours trapped inside a crowded metal tube traveling across the country. But as he stood there with his face turned toward the sky, having this rare moment of peace in his busy day, he suddenly heard a terrifying metallic groaning sound. It was immediately followed by a deafening, explosive bang that sounded like a bomb going off. Before David could even begin to process what was happening or where the sound had come from, he looked up and saw a massive, jagged piece of metal spinning violently through the air directly above him, descending at an incredible speed, at the exact same time that David was standing in line, just a short distance away on a busy street level next to the Pan Am building. A woman named Ann Barnett was standing at a crowded bus stop. Ann was a hardworking woman who was just trying to get home after a long, exhausting day at her job. All around her, the sidewalk was absolutely packed with thousands of commuters, all rushing to get to subway stations, bus stops, and train terminals. It was the height of the evening rush hour, and the city was a chaotic sea of movement and noise. Ann was staring down the street, anxiously looking for her bus to arrive. She knew that even after she got on the bus, she still had a grueling, hour-long commute ahead of her before she would finally be back in her apartment in the Bronx. If the traffic was as bad as it usually was, that commute could easily turn into 2 hours. It was a miserable daily grind, but Ann did it every single day without complaint. It was just a part of her life. As she stood there waiting, the noisy chatter of the city was suddenly pierced by the sound of screams. Ann turned her head, trying to see what was causing the commotion. Then, a series of bizarre and terrifying sounds began to echo through the air. First, there was a massive, booming crash that felt like it shook the concrete beneath her feet. Then, a rapid succession of sharp cracking noises, followed by a loud roaring sound that grew louder by the second. And finally, she heard a sound that she would later describe as sounding like thousands of tiny, delicate bells all ringing at the exact same time. Instinctively, Ann knew that something was terribly wrong. She did not know what was happening, but she saw people all around her screaming in terror and running in every direction. She threw her arms up over her head, ducking down to try and protect herself from whatever was coming. But her quick reflexes were not enough to save her. Almost immediately, Ann felt a burst of agonizing pain explode in her arms and head. The force of the impact knocked her off her feet, and she collapsed heavily onto the hard pavement of the sidewalk. As she lay there on her back, her vision fading, she looked up at the sky. The last thing she would have seen before losing consciousness was the air itself appearing to glitter as if it were filled with millions of sparkling diamonds. What happened to Ann Barnett and David Toomey on that warm May afternoon would shock the entire city of New York and permanently change the way people traveled through the city forever. You see, the expensive, luxury shuttle service that David had paid for was not a bus or a train. It was a massive commercial helicopter service. The helicopter, a large Sikorsky S-61, operated directly from a landing pad located on the very roof of the 59-story Pan Am building. The company that ran the helicopter service was highly focused on speed and efficiency. To save valuable time and keep their wealthy clients happy, they had a strict policy. Whenever the helicopter landed on the rooftop pad, the pilots would keep the massive rotor engines running at full power while the passengers disembarked and the new passengers climbed aboard. This kept the turnaround time down to just a few minutes, but it put an immense amount of physical stress on the helicopter's heavy mechanical parts. On that particular afternoon, just as the helicopter had landed and the passengers were switching out, a critical component of the aircraft failed. One of the heavy metal landing gear struts, which supports the entire weight of the helicopter, suddenly snapped under the pressure. With the engines still screaming at full power, the massive helicopter instantly tipped over onto its side. The giant spinning rotor blades, which were over 60 feet long and made of solid metal, struck the concrete surface of the roof. The blades immediately shattered and snapped off, turning into massive, lethal projectiles. They went spinning wildly across the rooftop at incredible speeds, slicing through the line of passengers who were waiting to board. David Toomey and 3 other people standing on the roof were killed instantly by the flying blades. But the tragedy did not stop there. The shattered, heavy metal rotor blades did not stay on the roof. The force of the impact sent the massive, jagged pieces of metal flying over the edge of the 59-story building. As these heavy blades plummeted down toward the crowded streets below, they struck the side of the skyscraper, smashing through dozens of glass windows on their way down. This created a massive, lethal shower of shattered glass and sharp metal shards that rained down on the crowded sidewalks below. That was the sound of thousands of tiny bells that Ann had heard right before she was struck. One of the falling helicopter blades, weighing hundreds of pounds, fell all the way to the street level and struck Ann as she stood at the bus stop, killing her instantly. The horrific accident resulted in 5 total fatalities and left many others severely injured. The rooftop helicopter pad on the Pan Am building was immediately closed down permanently, and the city of New York quickly passed a strict law banning all commercial helicopter landings on the rooftops of skyscrapers, ensuring that a tragedy like this could never happen again. For our third and final story, we are going to travel back even further in time to the year 1940 in the city of Santa Rosa, California. On the morning of March 26th, a heavy rainstorm was battering the region. A 35-year-old seasonal farm worker named Millard Taylor was running as fast as he could through the torrential downpour. He was heading toward a large old fruit warehouse owned by a local agricultural company. The rain was freezing cold and the wind was howling. Millard's clothes were completely soaked through and his teeth were chattering uncontrollably. He was desperately searching for any kind of shelter to get out of the freezing storm. Millard did not actually live in Santa Rosa. He was an indigenous man who lived on a reservation in a different part of California for most of the year. But every year, when the harvest season arrived, Millard and thousands of other migrant workers from all across the country would travel to Santa Rosa to find work. It was a hard, physically demanding way to make a living, but it was the only way these workers could earn enough money to survive. However, because there were so many workers flooding into the small town at the same time, there was nowhere near enough housing for them. As a result, Millard and most of the other harvest workers were essentially homeless. They were forced to live in a massive, makeshift encampment that they had built along the railroad tracks on the edge of town. During normal weather, this arrangement was actually manageable. The nights in Santa Rosa could get incredibly cold, but the workers had constructed dozens of large makeshift fire pits along the tracks. These fires were kept burning all day and all night, providing much-needed warmth and a place for the workers to cook their meals. Finding firewood was usually very easy because there was a lot of brush and old wood in the surrounding area, and the workers took turns collecting it to keep the fires going. But on this particular morning, the storm was so severe that building a fire was absolutely impossible. The rain was coming down in sheets, putting out any spark instantly, and the wind was ripping through their makeshift tents. Staying at the encampment was no longer bearable. Millard had run to the fruit warehouse, hoping to find a dry place to wait out the storm. Just as he reached the massive building, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the dark sky, followed by a deafening crash of thunder. Millard did not try to go inside the warehouse because he knew the main doors were locked tight. The building was used to store hundreds of tons of dried prunes that had been harvested, and the owners kept it locked up to prevent theft. But the warehouse was a massive, 200-foot-wide wooden structure that was built on top of thick wooden support posts, raising the entire building several feet off the wet ground to protect the fruit from moisture and pests. This created a large, open space underneath the building. It was not very tall, but it was easily big enough for a person to crawl under and sit down comfortably, completely shielded from the rain by the heavy floorboards above. Millard ducked down and crawled into the dry dirt beneath the warehouse. He was relieved to find that several other workers had already had the same idea. There were 8 other men sitting under there, huddled together to stay warm. They had a large jug of cheap wine that they were passing around, sharing stories and laughing, trying to make the best of a miserable situation. As the hours passed, the storm only seemed to get worse. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the wind battered the old wooden warehouse, making it creak and groan. Below the building, the workers noticed that the water was beginning to pool around the edges of the dry dirt, and it was slowly starting to flood the space where they were sitting. But they had nowhere else to go, so they huddled closer together, taking drinks from the wine jug and hoping the storm would pass soon. At the exact same time, in a small office building located just a few yards away from the warehouse, an employee named Gordon Boyd was sitting at his desk. Gordon was a quiet, dedicated office worker for the fruit company, and he was busy catching up on some paperwork while the storm raged outside. Suddenly, above the sound of the howling wind and pounding rain, Gordon heard an incredibly loud, sharp cracking noise. It was immediately followed by a deep, terrifying rumbling sound that felt like an earthquake. The noise was so loud that Gordon dropped his pen and stood up. As soon as the rumbling stopped, he ran to the door and stepped out into the pouring rain to see what had happened. When he looked toward the warehouse, he stopped and stared in absolute shock. The massive, 200-foot-wide wooden warehouse had completely collapsed into a giant pile of splintered wood and debris. Gordon could not believe his eyes. The building had stood for years, surviving many storms that were far worse than this one. He had no idea how a simple rainstorm could have caused the entire structure to completely fail. He stood there in the pouring rain, staring at the wreckage, unsure of what to do. Then, he looked off into the distance toward the railroad tracks where the workers' encampment was located. Usually, even in bad weather, he could see the smoke or the dim glow of the workers' fires. But today, the area was completely dark. There was not a single fire burning. He knew how cold and miserable the workers must be, and he realized that they would have been desperately searching for a dry place to shelter from the storm. And he knew that one of their favorite places to hang out was underneath the very warehouse that now lay in a ruined heap of heavy timbers. Gordon's heart sank. He ran toward the pile of wreckage, his eyes scanning the debris. As he got closer, his worst fears were confirmed. Sticking out from beneath a massive, heavy wooden beam was a single, motionless human hand. He realized with horror that there were people trapped beneath the collapsed building. The truth of why the warehouse had collapsed was both tragic and bizarre. The seasonal workers who lived in the encampment relied entirely on those fire pits to stay warm and cook their food. But because there were thousands of workers, the demand for firewood was incredibly high. Over the course of the harvest season, the local wood supply had begun to run low. Some of the workers had discovered that the space underneath the warehouse was filled with thick, sturdy wooden beams. Specifically, the building was supported by diagonal wooden beams called sway braces. These braces ran horizontally and diagonally between the main vertical support posts, and their sole purpose was to keep the building stable and prevent it from swaying or shifting sideways during high winds or earthquakes. To the workers, these braces just looked like extra pieces of wood that were not doing much. So, over the course of several months, workers had been going under the warehouse with saws and crowbars, slowly removing the wooden sway braces and carrying them back to the encampment to use as firewood. By the time the severe storm hit on March 26th, so many of the crucial sway braces had been chopped up and burned that the building's structural integrity was almost entirely gone. When the heavy winds and rain began to batter the warehouse, and with the added weight of hundreds of tons of dried prunes stored on the floor above, the weakened support posts simply could not hold. The building shifted sideways and collapsed instantly, crushing the 9 men who were sheltering directly beneath it. Gordon immediately ran back to his office and called the local sheriff. A massive rescue effort was launched, with dozens of deputies, company employees, and fellow farm workers frantically digging through the heavy wooden debris in the pouring rain. They worked for hours, desperate to find survivors. But it was no use. All 9 of the workers who had been sheltering under the building, including 35-year-old Millard Taylor, had been crushed to death instantly when the heavy floor collapsed on top of them. An official investigation was launched into the disaster, but ultimately the deaths were ruled to be a tragic accident. No criminal charges were ever filed, as it was impossible to determine exactly who had removed the support beams, and the company was not found to be negligent since they had no idea the workers were damaging the building's foundation. The tragedy served as a somber reminder of the extreme hidden dangers that can arise when people are forced to desperate measures just to survive the elements. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.